She knocked on the door and said she was a nurse. The elderly woman inside, living alone, trusting, grateful for any help, let her in. And that was the last decision she ever made. This happened at least 16 times in Mexico City between 1998 and 2006. Possibly 40 times, maybe more. Elderly women strangled in their own homes, their bodies left behind, their small possessions taken. A stethoscope, a phone cord, a curtain tie. The police spent years looking for a man. They arrested transvestites. They ran down dead ends. They let the real killer walk in and out of a police station without recognizing her. She even appeared on a television program about wrestling. 1 week before her arrest, her name was Juana Barraza. She was a 50-year-old professional masked wrestler, and Mexico had no idea she existed until the day she walked out of a murdered woman's apartment and into the arms of a passing police patrol. This is the full story. No filter. This is Uncut Cases, real crimes. No filter. Let's get into it. Juana Dayanara Barraza Samperio was born on December 27, 1957 in Epazoyucan, a small municipality in the state of Hidalgo, about 2 hours north of Mexico City. Her childhood was, by any measure, brutal. Her father left the family on the day she was born, taking her brother with him and leaving Juana and her mother behind. Her mother, an alcoholic, struggled to care for her. And then one day, Juana was approximately 12 years old. Her mother took her to a cantina. She had been drinking, and in a transaction that would define everything that came after, her mother handed Juana to a man in exchange for 3 beers. 3 beers. The man she was given to was not a guardian. He was an abuser. He beat her. He raped her. She became pregnant as a result. Prosecutors would later argue in court that Juana Barraza never fully processed what her mother had done to her, that the rage she carried from that moment forward, the rage at an older woman who had given her away for nothing, was still alive in her decades later, still looking for somewhere to go. She survived. Somehow she built a life. She became a single mother herself, raising 4 children, one of whom died. And she pursued an unlikely career, Mexican lucha libre wrestling. The masked, theatrical, acrobatic combat sport that is as much performance as it is sport. She competed under a ring name that would later take on a significance no one anticipated. La Dama del Silencio, the Lady of Silence. In the wrestling world, she was known. She was respected. She had a following. People who watched her perform on weekends had no idea that the same woman who performed in that ring was, in the years between 1998 and 2006, entering the apartments of elderly women across Mexico City and strangling them. It is one of the most jarring details in a case full of jarring details. A professional performer, a public figure in a small world, and a serial killer. The method was consistent. That consistency was one of the things that made investigators eventually recognize they were dealing with a serial killer. Though it took them years longer than it should have, Juana Barraza would present herself at the door of an elderly woman living alone. She posed as a nurse, sometimes a government social worker, sometimes a representative from a pension or healthcare program. In a city where government health programs regularly sent workers door to door, this was not unusual. It was not suspicious. It was, in fact, and exactly the kind of visit an isolated elderly woman might welcome. She would be let in. Inside, at some point during the visit, she would strangle her victim. She used whatever was available: a stethoscope, a phone cable, tights, a curtain cord. She was physically powerful. Years of professional wrestling had given her a build that witnesses consistently described as large and masculine. The strangulation was not quick. These were elderly women living alone. There was no one to call out to, no one to hear. After the killing, she would take small items, religious icons, jewelry, objects of little monetary value but personal significance to the women who owned them. Whether this was opportunistic theft or something more psychologically significant was debated among investigators and profilers. The victims were elderly women, most living alone, many in the working-class neighborhoods of Mexico City, Venustiano Carranza, Gustavo A. Madero, Iztapalapa. They were women who had survived poverty, who had raised families, who had reached old age and found themselves isolated. They were, in the language the Mexican press would later use, women who had become invisible to society. And they were being killed one by someone who relied on that invisibility. The official conviction covers 16 murders. The number of victims investigators actually linked to her through evidence and circumstance is between 40 and 48. Some estimates go higher. The exact number will probably never be known, because many of the deaths in those years were not initially treated as suspicious. Old women die. That was the assumption. It took years before anyone looked at the pattern. Between 1998 and 2003, the murders went largely unnoticed by the public. It was not until November 2003 that Mexico City police officially acknowledged they were looking for a serial killer. Someone posing as a nurse or social worker, tall, with rough features. And even that acknowledgement came slowly, reluctantly, and with significant political interference. Here is where the investigation becomes something almost impossible to explain. Mexico City police, working from witness descriptions of the killer as a large, masculine-looking woman, concluded early in the investigation that they were looking for a transvestite or transgender person. This was not an unreasonable initial inference. The witness descriptions were consistent. The physical description, broad shoulders, large hands, masculine features, matched their working profile. What was unreasonable was what came next. In October 2005, police conducted raids on transgender sex workers across Mexico City. They detained and fingerprinted dozens of people. None of them matched, not one. And rather than reconsidering the profile, investigators concluded, officially, that the killer was not a transvestite, but that it was definitely still a transgender person. They widened the raids. They detained more people. They questioned more individuals who had nothing to do with the murders. Months passed. The real killer kept working. Then in November 2005, a witness reported seeing a large woman in a red blouse leaving the home of a murdered woman. This was not a new development in terms of the physical description. It matched what witnesses had been saying for years. But it renewed pressure on police to find her. In December 2005, with no arrests and mounting public criticism, police began doing something that tells you everything about how lost they were. They started fingerprinting the bodies of elderly women in the city's morgues. Their working theory was that La Mataviejitas had committed suicide and might be among the unclaimed dead. She had not committed suicide. She was very much alive. And here is the detail that defines this investigation. At some point during the years of this investigation, Juana Barraza had been inside a police station. She had been there for an unrelated reason. Officers had seen her, and she left without anyone connecting her to the case. She also appeared on a television program about wrestling, a public broadcast seen by thousands 1 week before her arrest. The investigation was, in the most direct terms, a failure, not because the police lacked information, because the assumption that a serial killer targeting elderly women had to be a man, or at minimum a biological male, was so deeply embedded that evidence to the contrary was being filtered through it rather than evaluated on its own terms. On January 25, 2006, Juana Barraza visited the apartment of Ana Maria de los Reyes Alfaro, an 82-year-old woman living in the Venustiano Carranza neighborhood of Mexico City. She strangled her with a stethoscope. As she was leaving the building, a tenant who rented a room in the property returned home. He saw Juana Barraza leaving. He saw his landlady's body on the floor. He alerted a police patrol that happened to be nearby. She was arrested on the street within minutes. When investigators searched her home, what they found confirmed what they were dealing with. There was a trophy room, newspaper clippings about the Mataviejitas murders, collected, organized, displayed, objects taken from victims, an altar to Jesus Malverde and Santa Muerte, two folk saints commonly venerated in Mexican criminal culture. She had been following her own coverage. She had been keeping score. A forensic analysis linked her fingerprints to the scenes of multiple murders. The physical evidence was substantial. But here is something that received relatively little attention at the time. After her arrest, investigators made Juana Barraza pose next to the police composite sketches and bust that had been publicly circulated during the investigation. The comparison was damning, not just because she resembled the sketches, but because it demonstrated how precisely the witness descriptions had been. People had been telling the truth for years about what they saw. The investigation had simply failed to follow that truth to its logical conclusion. She denied killing all of the victims investigators attributed to her. She admitted to some. She showed no remorse about the ones she admitted to. She was, throughout the entire process, calm, silent, the lady of silence to the end. In 2008, Juana Barraza was convicted of 11 counts of murder and 11 counts of aggravated robbery. She was sentenced to 759 years in prison at the time, the longest sentence ever handed down by a Mexico City court for homicide. Under Mexican law, sentences run concurrently rather than consecutively. The practical maximum she will serve is 50 years. She is currently 68 years old, imprisoned at the Santa Marta Acatitla Women's Prison in Mexico City. The 16 convictions represent the murders the prosecution could prove beyond reasonable doubt. The 40 to 48 additional deaths investigators attributed to her, the ones that weren't initially treated as suspicious, the ones where evidence had degraded or disappeared, the ones where old women had been found dead and no one had looked closely enough. Those cases are effectively closed. There was a Netflix documentary in 2023, The Lady of Silence, The Mataviejitas Murders, directed by Maria Jose Cuevas. It is worth watching. It raised serious questions about the evidence connecting Barraza to all of the killings, and whether the investigation's failures had resulted in some cases being attributed to her that may have involved other perpetrators. Those questions have never been formally answered. A book was published, songs were written. She became, in a very Mexican way, a figure of dark cultural fascination. Her wrestling persona absorbed into the mythology of the case in ways that sometimes overshadowed the 40-plus women who died. Here is what I want to say about this case clearly. 40-plus elderly women were strangled in their homes across Mexico City over 8 years. Many of those deaths were initially not treated as murders at all, because old women die, and investigating their deaths was not a priority. The invisibility that made those women vulnerable to a killer was the same invisibility that allowed the killing to continue for so long. When investigators finally acknowledged a serial killer was involved, their response was to spend months rating the transgender community based on a physical description that should have been read differently from the start. Dozens of people who had nothing to do with any of this were detained, fingerprinted, and released. The actual killer walked through a police station and appeared on television. The prosecution convicted Juana Barraza of 16 murders and sentenced her to 759 years. That number is dramatic enough that it tends to end the conversation. But the conversation that should have happened about why 40 women had to die before the right person was even identified, about who failed those women and why, about what institutional assumptions made that failure possible. That conversation never really got the attention it deserved. A Netflix documentary and a book and songs written about her wrestling persona are not justice. They are content. The 40-plus women who died in their homes trusting a stranger who said she was there to help deserve more than content. What do you think the real failure in this case was? The investigation, the system, or something else? Drop your take in the comments. I read everyone.